Committee will come to order. We have votes scheduled probably in about 5 to 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can, and then we'll come back after votes and start with our Q&A series. Pleased to welcome our second panel witnesses on domestic terrorism. Our second panel includes Mr. David Roush, the Chief of Police for the City of Knoxville, Tennessee, Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Associate Dean and Director of the Global Social Action Agenda at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and Mr. Richard Cohen, President of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I want to thank all of you for being here today. The Chair now recognizes Police Chief Roush for his testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairman McCall. Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about worldwide threats, specifically domestic terrorism and the threat posed by extremist groups. My name is Chief David Roush. I'm currently the Chief of Police in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm also a member of the Executive Board of Directors for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and currently the General Chair for the IACP Midsize Agencies Division, which represents agencies with 50 to 999 sworn officers. The ICP is the world's largest association of law enforcement leaders with more than 30,000 members in 150 different countries. I've been fortunate to have been trained by the FBI in domestic and international terrorism, as well as participated in training at the U.S. Army War College, in addition to my over 28 years of experience in law enforcement. Today's law enforcement officers face an incredible set of challenges. One of the many myriad of challenges we confront is how to best respond to planned rallies, spontaneous crowds, and civil disturbances by extremist groups while balancing First Amendment rights. All too often, what may have been started as a peaceful demonstration can spawn protests and counter-protests that can lead to civil disorder. Groups with varying social and political agendas that wish to express their concerns over war, abortion, environmental issues, policy decisions, and numerous other issues can and have sparked violent and even deadly actions and reactions. And most recently, we witnessed that in Charlottesville, Virginia. A few short weeks after that incident on August 26, we had a protest over a monument in Knoxville, and we used what we learned from Charlottesville, from Boston, and from Durham, North Carolina to assure a safe, peaceful gathering. Each of these cities were faced with rallies addressing Civil War statutes or monuments and free speech by groups known for hate. I will share what we learned from those events, and I will discuss some of the challenges law enforcement faces when it comes to policing extremist groups and where we could benefit from assistance from the federal government. Civil disturbances and demonstrations have changed over the years, as have the tactics and techniques of extremist groups that organize these protests and gatherings. Demonstrations and public protests have taken on a more systemic, organized nature and have invoked tools that were not available in past decades. Social media is now commonly used to rapidly mobilize and manage participants prior to and during demonstrations and civil disturbances. Communities, well, some of the issues there, of course, are with the social media allowing the expression of hate in forms that are that we have noticed recently. Law enforcement needs the assistance and cooperation of those who manage the social media mediums to monitor their sites and not allow them to be used for this purpose. The companies need protection from frivolous lawsuits that prevent them from taking needed action to do this. We need the ability to have those who are pushing a violent hate agenda to be held accountable for violence that results from their efforts. Additionally, continued resources to the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice in the form of community policing grants, Safe Streets funding, and other resources are vital for the continuation of being able to address these efforts to prevent and intervene violent extremists. It is vital that all levels of government and the private sector work together to identify and address individuals and organizations that are involved in violence and hate. This information needs to be provided immediately in real time to all who may be impacted, especially those who are responsible for the safety of our communities. There should be no barriers to the sharing of information. Fusion centers have been effective at providing this information, but they are only as good as the information that they are provided or they learn through their efforts. The ability to gather intelligence information must not be hindered. We certainly understand the concerns of too much government intrusion, but we can't allow this distrust of government to allow those who seek to harm us to thrive. There can be appropriate intelligence gathering that is properly monitored to protect us all. We must assure that we are watching and not allow those tools that law enforcement use to get taken away. The ability of a local community to control events in their jurisdiction is vital. The power to require notice of an event to assess the level of concern for a community is paramount. Permitting is a process that allows this to be done effectively. The process gives local government the opportunity to appropriately protect all who wish to participate or to make a decision to decline a permit based on factual concerns for the overall safety of a community. A failure to obtain a permit should be reason to decline a gathering or to declare a gathering illegal. Permitting allows for clear communication between the jurisdiction and the event organizers. Contact with leaders of a demonstration is important to gather information and establish ground rules for the event, in particular non-negotiable matters, with the intention that a common understanding be reached by both parties on the ground rules. In our protest in Knoxville, it was advertised on social media. A local white supremacist group announced that they would be holding a Support the Monument rally at a Civil War monument that had been vandalized after Charlottesville. We were familiar with the group planning this, and they had gatherings previously. Then 3 other groups began organizing counter-protests against the white supremacist hate group. We were familiar with some of these groups. The support for the counter-protesters was substantially larger than the white supremacist hate groups. Our intelligence unit began monitoring all the known problem groups in our area, and they were inciting each other by posing as members of the opposite group and making statements about the need for violence. One of the counter-protest groups contacted us to request approval to conduct a march, and that was denied because of the recent events that we had seen in other locations. The Support the Monument group never sought a permit. They advised they were just going to meet at the monument, and then we decided to take control of that. Too many of these groups who gather spew hate and violence now hide under the cloak of the First Amendment. We need to be able to delineate between exercising freedom of speech and violent behavior. Having the ability to put reasonable rules in place and control these gatherings is important. I know I've gone over my time there, Mr. Chair. I will just tie it up just saying that we believe that there are a lot of tools that could be made available to us. As you know, I'm sure there'll be some questions. I can get further into that.
I appreciate it, Chief Roush. And your full statement will be included in the record. Chair now recognizes Rabbi Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Thompson and the rest of the members, distinguished members of Congress. I want to thank you for allowing us to be here on behalf of our 400,000 constituents of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. We're named first in honor and now in memory of Simon Wiesenthal, the great Nazi hunter who lost 89 members of his family during World War II. When he was liberated by U.S. troops at Mauthausen, he was too weak to stand and embrace his liberators, and he dedicated the rest of his life seeking justice and not vengeance, brought 1,100 of the perpetrators before the bar of justice, and changed the way civilization looked at the responsibilities of dealing with the crimes of genocide. He warned, quote, "I know that the hate did not die with Hitler in the Berlin bunker." And tragically, how right he proved to be. Before I go on, I just think this is also an appropriate moment to thank your father, Mr. Chairman, who I learned from you flew 32 missions over Europe, participated in D-Day, representing the greatest generation. And it might be a little bit late, but it's the appropriate time to say thank you. The threats of extreme anti-Semitism in the U.S. in our time trace back to the 80s. The small but extremely violent order assassinated Denver talk show host Alan Berg in '84 and planned to foment a race war in our country. Neo-Nazi skinhead and militia movements in the late 80s and 90s often combined white separatist doctrine with anti-Jewish theory and practice. It's already been 30 years. But anti-Jewish hate crimes forced many Jewish institutions across our country to undertake costly security measures to protect people at prayer and kids at school. For a generation, Jews attending synagogue services or dropping their children off at a school have accepted the necessity of having guards, often armed, security cameras, and other paraphernalia. Annual FBI stats prove that it's not paranoia. Jews, unfortunately, every year is the #1 target of religion-based hate crimes, And I would add that African Americans, unfortunately, every year are the #1 continuing target of race-based hate crimes. In 1999, Buford Furrow, trained in William Pierce and Tom Metzger's doctrine of leaderless resistance, came down to Los Angeles with the plan to attack our Museum of Tolerance. He landed up using a softer target, which was a Jewish summer day camp. Children as young as 6 years old were shot before he murdered a Filipino-American U.S. Postal Service employee. 2 years later, 9/11 changed our world forever. It's one of the reasons we're here today. Against this backdrop, earlier this year, there were over 120 bomb threats made against Jewish community centers across our country. These threats evoke painful memories of earlier deadly attacks at JCCs, including Granada Hills, California, Seattle, Washington, and Overland, Kansas. Thousands of young families, including a young colleague of mine at the Wiesenthal Center, were deeply traumatized as their 4- and 5-year-olds were suddenly and hurriedly evacuated from their classrooms. Despite strenuous efforts in federal local law enforcement, for which we are incredibly grateful, it took months to identify the main culprit of these threats of domestic terrorism. The majority of those threats emanated not from here, but from overseas, traced back to one young suspect in Israel. But 2017 has witnessed more than bomb threats. It was a year where the oldest hate manifested on too many of our nation's campuses were delivered to our personal emails and spouted from pulpits of religious leaders. The sources: extremist elements of the new alt-right, self-proclaimed white nationalists and outright Nazis, theologically fueled and validated Islamist hate rhetoric, extreme anti-Israel campaigns on campus that demonize the Jewish state and her Zionist supporters. What has changed? Well, we heard a phenomenal panel before, detail in great professionals. The Internet. The Internet is used to incubate and validate hate, to inspire and empower and even train lone wolf attackers. It has created new global relationships among extremists, unimaginable 20 years ago. It offers anonymity. We saw that the new generation of young Nazis were able to utilize Charlottesville in a way to capture national and global attention by staging Nazi-like torchlight parades and uploading video in real time via social media with little or no consequences to the perpetrators. I want to go directly to the fact that a few weeks ago, we participated in hearings at the House Judiciary Committee, which was considering undertaking some steps to help Jewish kids endangered on campus. Unfortunately, to this point, a bill which passed 100-0 in the Senate is still being held up by Chairman Goodlatte. And as a result, the U.S. Department of Education has not adjudicated a single case involving anti-Semitism in the United States against students on campus. And then the Islamist rhetoric attacks, such as the one in Davis, California, in which people have used religious pulpits in order to call for genocide against the Jewish community. I'm a rabbi, so I'm very sensitive to the fact that we don't want to curtail either First Amendment or tell religious leaders what they should do. But I'm also a sports fan. I believe in a level playing field. The kind of rhetoric that has been used to attack our community and Christians by certain Islamist personalities, imams in our country, has simply not elicited the kind of response that the Muslim leadership in this country should show, especially since the American Muslims themselves have suffered a spike in hate crimes targeting them in the last year. Finally, is there a role for DHS? I'm aware that DHS's role in combating domestic terrorism and anti-Semitism is secondary to that of the DOJ and FBI. I'm also aware that DHS's role is not to dictate policies that would hold extremists accountable for their acts. Nonetheless, DHS was born in wake of the brutal lessons wrought from the ashes and agony of 9/11. We learned as a nation that America had to move to correct serious flaws in our fundamental approach to securing our nation from ever-morphing multiple threats. It is our view that local hate crime units, state homeland security, and relevant federal agencies must be able to quickly update and expand their understandings of extremist ideologies from the far right to the extreme left that would actually help them better understand the raw intelligence that comes their way. The Simon Wiesenthal Center is urging the committee, and through you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, to consider ways to enable the Homeland Security operation to be able to intake from NGOs, human rights advocates, and other community-based groups throughout the United States with the kind of information which I think would better help the brilliant and committed people we've heard who deal with materials we will never see, but by virtue of the fact that the Wiesenthal Center looks only at open source material, sometimes we can provide a little bit perspective since we're not doing industrial fishing. We actually do it the old-fashioned way. So it is our hope that together with all of the other organizations and those who are not able to attend here today, would be given an opportunity to have a platform where the agencies that we heard from earlier today and the other relevant groups, probably through fusion centers, would be able to have access to the kinds of perspective information that we would like to share with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. We have about 2 minutes on the clock to vote. So what I'd like to do is go vote. That's why I think the ranking member and I are the only two left here. So we're going to go vote. There are 4 votes. We'll come back, and then we'll hear from Mr. Cohen.
Okay.
We'll stay in recess. What was good last?
I have to thank you for taking these longer than 5 minutes. As it is, it's torture for a clergyman to look at a clock. It's an interesting, funny but true story. A friend of mine who also is very involved in interfaith had a very good training You know what? Next Saturday morning, I'm coming to your synagogue. It's been like 15 years. What time should I come? He said, well, the repast begins at about 11:30. I want to come like 10:45. And he said, oh, no, I want to hear the whole thing. What time do you start? He says, we start at 9 o'clock. Sure enough,
Committee will come to order. Chair now recognizes Mr. Cohen for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman McCall, and thank you, Ranking Member Thompson. Members of the committee, it's an honor to be here today. Charlottesville truly was a wake-up call for our country. It was a reminder that the oldest form of terrorism our country has ever known is still with us. It was proof that the white supremacist movement has been energized by Mr. Trump's campaign. Proof that Mr. Trump's campaign has, quote, unearthed some demons, to use Congressman Sanford's words. The marchers' chant in Charlottesville, "You will not replace us," was an expression of paranoia over cultural displacement. It reminds us of what Dylann Roof said when he murdered 9 people in a Charleston church. You're taking over our country. The marchers chant, blood and soil. Their anti-Semitism reminds us of one of the darkest chapters in modern history. In my written testimony, I called the threat associated with groups like ISIS the most acute ones we face. So I certainly don't take issue with Director Wray's calling it our main terrorism threat. But I worry that calling the threat from domestic extremist groups like those in Charlottesville merely a steady one, as Director Wray has called it, may lead us to underestimate the danger that the current white supremacist movement poses, not just to our physical safety, but to the very soul of our nation. And I worry that calling the domestic extremist threat merely a steady one may lead us once again not to give it the attention it deserves. That's why I think the joint resolution that this Congress passed unanimously in September and that the President signed is so important. The resolution recognizes the growing threat from racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic hate groups in our country. It urges the President and his administration to use all available resources to address that threat. And it calls on the Attorney General to vigorously prosecute criminal acts from the radical right and to improve the reporting of hate crimes. That reporting, I'd note, is woefully inadequate. The FBI's recent report counted approximately 6,000 hate crimes in 2016. Yet, the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that as many as 250,000 hate crimes may be occurring annually. So clearly, we have a disconnect here. As you know, the Charlottesville resolution urges various things, but has no enforceable provisions. That's why it's so critical that this committee hold oversight hearings in the very near future to ensure that the President is living up to the commitments he made when he signed the resolution. I would also ask this committee to recommend legislation similar to that which Senator Durbin has proposed that would institutionalize a focus on terrorism from the radical right within our federal law enforcement agencies. That threat is the oldest our country faces. Charlottesville demonstrates that it's lethal, and it's likely to be with us long after we hopefully have addressed the threat of terror from groups like ISIS. It deserves a full measure of our attention. Senator Durbin's bill would do many other things, including preserving funding for the state and local anti-terrorism program, SLAT for short, a critical program that has been on the chopping block. As I mentioned in my written testimony, my colleagues and I at the Southern Poverty Law Center are representing Susan Bro, the mother of Heather Heyer, the young woman who was killed when a white supremacist drove his car into a crowd of protesters in Charlottesville. At the funeral of her daughter, Susan said, "They tried to kill my child to shut her up, but guess what? You just magnified her. I'd rather have my child," she said, "but by golly, if I have to give her up, we're going to make it count." I'll see Susan next week in Charlottesville, and I look forward to telling her that this committee is committed to doing everything in its power to curb the threat of radical right terrorism in our country and to make Heather's death count. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cohen, I think this is a very important hearing. I think we've seen it before with Tim McVeigh. I think Rabbi, thank you for pointing out my father's sort of, as I view his legacy of 32 bombing missions over the Nazis. And for the life of me, I don't understand this mindset of hatred and revival of the Nazi spirit that I thought we crushed in World War II. I was recently in Auschwitz 6 months ago to see the pure evil that was perpetrated by the Nazis that my father and his generation fought to defeat. So when I see skinheads and neo-Nazis and white supremacists assemble, not only am I sort of just confounded as to how this could happen, but I just find it completely immoral and unacceptable for this nation. My grandfather was also persecuted by the Klan because he was Catholic. So hatred in all forms, whether it be radical Islamist ideology or this type of hatred, cannot stand in this country. And we need to unite, I think, as a nation. So I want to thank all three of you for your testimony. And first, I want to ask Chief Roush, I mean, you had what could have been a similar Charlottesville on your hands. You had 3,000 people show up to protest a Confederate monument in Fort Sanders, Tennessee. Clearly, it's foreseeable that both of these factions are going to come together. You're going to have a lot of heated emotion and the potential for great violence. And yet, over a period of a 2.5-hour rally, we saw no violence. I think what you did is a model of leadership for how law enforcement, perhaps working with state law enforcement, can successfully prevent this kind of violence in the future. And I just wanted you to comment on what you did that may have been different from Charlottesville, that maybe law enforcement officers across the country can learn when this situation enters into their hometowns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I think we learned from watching what happened in other locations. And so we literally took the game tape from Charlottesville, from Boston, and from Durham, North Carolina, and sat down and went through it and talked about those things that were right and the things that were wrong. And we then strategized on how we address that with what we had coming at us. And so some of the things we saw that were right, Boston, their mayor and their chief did a great job of getting out in front and putting out the rules of what they would allow. They made a press release on Thursday before the Saturday rally and said these are the things that will be allowed at this rally. Now, in our assessment, they didn't go far enough. You know, they had some violence still at that, not as much, but they had some violence at that rally. And so we looked at all of that to determine how we would do ours. So first and foremost was getting the information out through the media to the public and to these groups that were converging of what would be allowed. Second was taking complete control of the area that they were going to be in. We took control of that early on. So one of the things that we had heard from Charlottesville was that they had some challenge with the areas that they were showing up that they didn't have control of. So we went in and took complete control, and we cordoned off the area. The vehicle threat was real, and so we took care of that by utilizing our public service, putting dump trucks at every vehicle access point to keep those types of vehicle-borne attacks from being able to take place. A lot of coordination and control, the coordination with our state partners, with our local and federal partners as well, on looking at intelligence information of these groups, what they were planning, what they were saying to each other, and early on was important. Some of the other things was putting the rules in place. We said there will be none of the things that we saw that caused the problems. So no sticks, no rocks, no bricks, no bottles, no firearms, all of that, no mask, nothing to cover yourself, to keep your identity from being known. All of that was important, that we put that in place immediately so that people knew these are the rules. We learned that a lot of the white supremacists didn't show up because of the rules. They didn't want to follow those rules, so they didn't come. Which was okay for our community. And so I think the success was a result of that, and then a well-executed plan by our team. They did a great job of making sure that we had everyone safe, and we kept control of the area, and it was just a well-executed plan as it worked.
Let me commend you for that. I think it's a textbook model of how to do it right, and I hope other police departments will learn from the good things that you did. I mean, I think it's a great model. Rabbi, I'm a kind of student of counterterrorism. I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor. I remember Ramzi Youssef.
Right.
His first target was not the World Trade Center. It was 12 Jewish synagogues symbolizing the 12 tribes of Israel. Pretty chilling. He did not. He decided to change that plan and go after the greatest symbol of financial might in New York, and that's the World Trade Center. When he almost successfully brought the Twin Towers down, of course, his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed came back and finished it.
Finished the job.
Sadly, and I know your community suffered greatly, and this whole country did. And that's why this committee was formed in the first place. But the Jewish community centers have been under threats constantly. I'm proud to say that this committee, working with the ranking member, doubled the authorization amount from FY17 for $50 million, 100% increase over the FY17. Also to what are called non-UASI jurisdictions. So I hope that's a step in the right direction for you. I think made great progress in that. But I would like for you to describe the threats that you're seeing currently to the centers and synagogues in this country right now.
Well, first of all, I think this is an appropriate time for the community to say thank you. Obviously, it's passed by law. There are appropriations, there are hearings, but I think for the Jewish community, especially for younger families who never experienced it before, it's traumatic, it's long-lasting, like any hate crime. It has both the personal and the communal impact. It may be difficult for our non-Jewish neighbors to understand, as I mentioned in my testimony, that it's been 3 decades since Jewish kids would be dropped off at a school where there wasn't an armed guard. And on a regular Saturday morning, I pray in a relatively modest-sized synagogue in Pico Boulevard in L.A., we were actually targeted by radicalized Islamist terrorists from California prisons for an attack that thank God, was interdicted before it took place. So, the mindset for Jewish community leaders, JCCs, schools, temples, and synagogues is to do your best with perimeter defense and to always have in mind, I was listening carefully about, the Friday night football game, and especially if it's going to be a playoff, and there's this tremendous energy. Our security has to be in place 52 weeks a year. And that, in a society, here we are in the capital of our nation, that's based, one of our basic freedoms, freedom of religion. As I mentioned in my testimony, this is not paranoia, it's just reality. And I know there's a lot of give and take, important discussions here about what's a greater threat from ISIS, or is it from the Nazi-like the types. Unfortunately, we have to grapple with both of them, and we rely very heavily on local law enforcement, the anti-crime, the anti-hate and terrorist units. And I think maybe the most important point I would like to sort of bring back to the one committee that actually still has it. We really need bipartisanship moving forward if we're fighting hate in America. To have some sort of what's a greater threat and to whom. I think we need to quantify what the threats are, but we have to move forward together as Americans to confront the bigots, the racists, or the terrorists. Otherwise, they win and we lose. And if you look at Charlottesville, the Nazis came that night, or whatever the groups came. They had a game plan. They weren't worried about the law. They knew what they were going to do on the internet. They even had a way to place themselves in their own minds as victims that night. Did you know that they've complained that they were actually pushed by law enforcement into the Antifa, and that's how the whole violence began. So when I look at that horrific piece of theater that was so incredibly effective for them, that was a group that did their own planning, and they understand the rules of the game. They knew what they wanted to violate, and we live in a day in which, because of the internet, everything local is global, and everything global is local. And as a result, whether it's something in the Middle East or the horrific events that took place on the bicycle path in New York, when those things take place, every single security officer of every Jewish institution across the United States has an immediate conversation with the rabbi, with the executive director. These are concerns that are not far removed from us on a daily basis.
Thank you, Rabbi. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel of witnesses for this hearing. Mr. Cohen, can you give the Southern Poverty Law Center's experience with domestic terrorist organizations here in the United States, whether you see a proliferation of that ideology or organization, and to what extent, what region of the country is it peculiar to, if so?
Thank you for the question. To answer the last part first, there is no region of our country that is not affected by hate groups, none, and that's quite unfortunate. Over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen an increase in the number of hate groups, driven, we think, primarily by the country's changing demographics. There's a backlash to it. You saw it during President Obama's administration, where he represented the kind of change that some people were scared of. It preceded him, but was intensified during his period of time. After 9/11, unfortunately, I think we saw in the country a retreat from a focus on the threat of traditional forms of domestic terrorism, partly for an understandable reason, the horror and carnage of 9/11. But I think the pendulum had swung too far. And, hopefully, after Charlottesville, which I think is a wake-up call, the pendulum will begin to swing back where we can take that form of threat more seriously.
Thank you very much. The other two witnesses talked a little bit about social media and how that has become the weapon of choice, if you please, for a lot of these hate groups. Chief, can you give us your experience about this, or your organizational experience?
Absolutely. Social media has become the platform. It has intensified the voice of hate. It's become the location that's basically made hate a megaphone to the rest of the world. And it is a place where, as the earlier panel had mentioned, it's where people are being radicalized. As the video that you showed earlier shows, that's the type of information that's being shared widely with individuals throughout the country. Before, you would have to be, as you mentioned, in an area that may have a large group of these types of individuals. Now it's wide open. Our experience is that they're constantly bombarding individuals with those types of videos and trying to normalize that mindset and that behavior.
Rabbi, what's been your experience?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm here with my colleague, Rick Eaton, who I consider one of the world's great experts on this issue. We put out an annual report that gives a snapshot. It's called Digital Terrorism and Hate. That's the project. And included over the last few years have been report cards. So we name names, and for a number of years, Twitter would get across the board F for doing nothing. Facebook has generally done a lot more than others, but they're grappling with 1.5 billion separate pages. We have always felt and continue to be convinced that an important component of fighting this virus has to be Silicon Valley, the individual companies. They cannot and should not hide behind First Amendment. They're in business. They're doing very nicely, thank you. And I think increasingly they recognize or have recognized some of their responsibilities, but they can do in their way a whole lot more than the combined membership of the United States House, Senate, and the executive branch. They're very powerful. They've collectively created the most powerful marketing tool ever. And while after 9/11 we were extremely worried that our far right here would be mimicking the Islamists, well, it turns out that Al-Qaeda and ISIS actually landed up mimicking our extremists when it came to lone wolf. That was a U.S. idea, then was brought over to Yemen. We know the results. But the Internet empowers and validates the individuals, the conspiracies, et cetera. And it's not so much at this point passing new laws. We have to really insist that our partners here, the collective genius that's giving us all these bells and whistles and social media and beyond, they have to be directly involved in degrading the marketing capabilities of the bigots, both local, national, and globally.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen, what's been your experience with those individuals and organizations and their use of social media?
Well, as not surprisingly, the hate exists now on the net. In 2008, when President Obama was elected, there were about 140,000 registered users on Stormfront, one of the oldest neo-Nazi websites. Today, there are over 330,000 registered users. It gives you some sense of kind of the growth of it. I'd echo what Rabbi Cooper said about kind of the digital platforms in the Silicon Valley. They're private businesses. They can do what they want. But all of them say in their terms of service that they're not going to allow hate. Sometimes they say that is merely a public relations ploy, right? And so we try to get them to live up to their terms of service, sometimes by embarrassing them publicly. PayPal, for example, was very slow to live up to its terms of service, but after Charlottesville, when they got some bad press, they did. So, we think it's important to recognize that hate is growing on the net. The anonymity, the ease of finding hate on the net fuels it. The echo chamber, as Rabbi Cooper said. And I think it's critically important for groups like us, not so much the government, but groups like us, to hold those companies to their terms of service.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, gentlemen, for your attendance. Mr. Cohen, I was looking at your organization's mission statement. It says the SPLC is dedicated to fighting hate and bigotry, among other things. And I would say that probably every member of this body agrees with you on that and those principles. Where we seem to disagree is that I think for most of us, and certainly for myself, I don't quantify or qualify, like some hate and bigotry is okay if it's this organization, but it's not okay if it's that organization. But it seems to me, in looking at your information, well, let me ask you this. Why does it seem there are no left-wing hate groups on your list? For example, on-campus groups like Students for Justice in Palestine that have advocated for violence against Jews. Why aren't they on your list?
Well, I don't know about that particular group. I couldn't answer that question. There are left-wing groups on our list.
Who are they?
Well, first, it depends, of course, on what you mean by left-wing. But, for example, the Nation of Islam, the New Black Panther Party on our list. We also have certain anti-Semitic groups that identify with groups like ISIS. So I think that it is not the case that our listing doesn't include any left-wing groups. We try to call hate as we see it. We limit our list not by left versus right, but by groups that vilify others for issues or for factors such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, or the like.
So your list also includes, as hate groups, mainstream, nonviolent public policy groups like the Family Research Council and the public interest law firms like Alliance Defending Freedom, but it doesn't list Antifa or other anarchist groups that actually literally call for violence against individuals. Does that seem to comport? To me, that reduces your credibility. Does it not to you?
No. And let me speak to both of those issues, if I could, sir. We list the Family Research Council not because it opposes gay marriage, but because it relentlessly vilifies the LGBT community and demonizes them with known lies and propaganda. That's why we list them.
But you don't list Antifa.
Yep, I was going to finish.
Okay.
Good. That's okay. Our listing of hate groups doesn't necessarily mean that they engage in violence, although we think that the anti-LGBT propaganda is one of the factors that makes the LGBT community in our country the most likely to be victimized by hate crimes. As if you are familiar with our work, we write about Antifa often. We condemn their tactics. I've said so publicly, and we do so always. But Antifa is not a group that vilifies people on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, or the like.
So you're okay with Antifa as long as they don't say things that you don't agree with, but it's okay if they hit people on the head with a bike lock, or set things on fire, or riot and flout the law by wearing face masks and incite riotous behavior. You're okay with that?
Of course not. And I said we condemn groups like Antifa. We write about them often.
But you don't list them, right? Are they on the hate map?
Could I finish?
Yes, sir.
We don't list them as hate groups.
Are they on the hate map?
No.
Okay.
Because they're not. They're not.
Well,
groups
let's move
that
on here. Let's move on here.
Okay.
Google revealed on a blog post that it is using machine language or learning regarding hate groups and events, and is partnering with the SPLC and others in that regard. How does the SPLC work with Google or its subsidiaries to modify search results of SPLC-designated people or groups?
What we try to get Google to do is not prioritize hate groups. I'll give you an example. A few years back, Google's algorithm was manipulated to rename the White House with a racist name. It used to be the case that when you would search for the Holocaust or Jews, you would get a rash of information, of anti-Semitic information. We tried to bring these kinds of issues to their attention. When Dylan Roof, for example, Googled black on white crime, he didn't get FBI statistics telling him the truth of the matter. Instead, he got hate websites such as that of the Council of Conservative Citizens. So we're trying to say to Google, your algorithm is flawed or easily manipulated.
But isn't
to
that
give
based
people
on your
incorrect
opinion, sir?
Well, I don't think there's any question but what Mr. Roof ran across when he Googled black on white on crime.
What about when Mr. Corkins Googled your website and then went and shot up the Family Research Council, including shooting an individual there, and then said that he was inspired by your website?
Look, we're no more responsible for what Mr. Corkins did based on reading our website than Martin Scorsese is for what John Hinckley
You're no
did.
more responsible, but yet Dylan Roof read whatever he read, and that is held as responsible for what he did. Well, and I'm not saying any of them are correct, but it seems like a breathtaking double standard of which you're used as a credible source for law enforcement, and you're testifying in front of Congress when it appears obviously that it's only your opinion that you base your hate groups and citations on.
Well, it is our opinion. It's an opinion that I think has a tremendous amount of credibility.
But no empirical evidence or data to back it up.
I think that's incorrect. I think if you look at our hate group listing and look at the people who we list as hate mongers, that you would agree with 99% of them.
Sir, my time has expired. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Correa from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and I want to thank the gentleman for being here today in this most important issue of addressing terrorism, domestic terrorism, white supremacist terrorism. And the earlier panel spoke, made some points about preparedness, what they were doing, what they were not doing. I would like to ask you essentially the same kind of questions, which is, from your perspective, is there something that the federal government, the FBI, that Homeland Security can be doing that we are not doing to address the issue of following these hate groups and making sure that they are not successful like they were in Oklahoma City? Yes, I open it up for quick answers to that question from the three of you.
I think there are a number of things that the federal government can and should do. One, I think institutionalizing a focus on the oldest form of terrorism that our country has seen. We don't want it to fall off, the radar of the federal agencies.
Do you see it falling off the radar now?
Well, I don't think there's any question but that it has after 9/11 to one degree or another under both administrations. I think there's been a bipartisan failure to devote the attention that it deserves. I mentioned to Senator Durbin's bill, there are other vehicles that could do that. One of the good features about Senator Durbin's bill is not only that it was required institutionalizing the focus on it, it also requires annual reports on the threat of white supremacist violence. I know Mr. Rogers, who's not here today, there was a bill that went through this committee and was passed in the House talking about having annual reports on on issues of terrorism. It should include a focus on domestic terrorism as well.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because Acting Secretary Duke just mentioned the blurring of that line, and I think it's absolutely correct. You can't focus on one versus the other. You know, every American life is sacred. Like all life, we got to make sure we go after every threat that there is to our citizenry.
Congressman,
Rabbi?
I'd like to come back to a point. I don't know about anyone else. I was very humbled and impressed by the first panel and how they've stepped up over the course of the last 15 years at a whole different level to protect our citizens. But they were very careful to emphasize at every opportunity that they're not in the quote-unquote ideology business. When you start getting that level where you have that kind of power to find out what citizens are doing, it's a good idea to have that kind of red line and firewall between that kind of activity. I think what this committee could look at, and certainly the Wiesenthal Center, and I'm sure everyone here, NAACP, all of the NGOs, everyone involved with civil society, we stand ready to try to fill in some of that on a volunteer basis if there would be an appropriate, whether it's through the fusion centers, the appropriate platform to actually inform the various federal, state, and local agencies about who's who in hate. Who are the players overseas who are impacting on individuals here or then go about threatening people in the local community? There's a lot of information that is available.
See, that's a very
like
interesting
ours.
concept, because that's essentially what we need to do with the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, which is on a volunteer basis. We can't legislate to keep up with technology, but if we can figure out how to get these folks to step up and volunteer and say, this does not smell correctly, something is afoot here, maybe you can take part of that responsibility as well and help the federal government keep our citizens safe.
Right. Well, I can already report to you that some of the most powerful companies in the Silicon Valley are always happy to see me leaving their offices. So we're there. And I do think that there is an important role, a bridge role, for this committee to help, create the appropriate input platform, and, probably through the Fusion Center concept, to make sure that if we actually come up with important ideas, or if the NAACP has statistics that are not necessarily available to a local anti-hate crimes agency, I think it would help, lift the efforts, make them more focused, and hopefully help protect Americans from the hate that we're now dealing with. Mr.
Roush?
Yeah, I would just add, in terms of the cooperation between federal, local, and state agencies, the JTTFs are vital. They are working together to address those things that you have concerns with. They are looking at the domestic terrorist. My office, I have 2 officers assigned to the JTTF that specifically that's what they do, is they look at our domestic terrorist, working with our federal partners, and so they work very closely with them. I also serve on the ICP's task force that's looking at enhancing law enforcement's response to hate crimes. And one of the things that I suggested there is we look at tools that we need. I've talked with several prosecutors and asked them about what tools they could use to better our opportunity to go after these who are committing these hate crimes. And what they said was they have a hard time proving ideology, right? What's in the mind. Hard time proving that part of the statute. And so they'll charge them with the crime that they've committed, right, which would be maybe an assault or a vandalism or something of that nature. And then they said that they're easier able to get that conviction. And so the hate part is a little challenging. So what I've suggested is for your body to look at, similar to what we do with gangs, and that is make it an enhancement, right? That we charge the crime, but make hate an enhancing crime. And so after you've charged them with the A crime, then you come back and after you get that conviction, you come back and you enhance it with the hate crime. And I think that would be much more effective, and you'd see an increase in holding people accountable for their ideologies.
Mr. Chair, I yield.
Chair recognizes Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I was the elected district attorney of Staten Island and indicted the very first hate crime on Staten Island in its history, and it resulted in my first death threat as well. So that was my reward for it, but I'm still here. So, Chief, as you heard, I was asking the FBI director about the whole idea of people disguising themselves with masks and crossing state lines to cause mayhem, whatever, in places, and how would codifying some of those prohibitions be helpful. You were very successful, Chief, in the experience that you just described to us in your opening remarks. Is there a federal codification of some of these things that you think? I think the chairman asked, Chief, could other law enforcement agencies learn from your good experience? Do you think there are codifications that may be helpful to you and others who are trying to protect our nation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking at a couple of areas, and I know they're controversial, but I think it's important when you talk about these protests and where they've gotten today. And you know, obviously, you know, we shouldn't restrict a person's ability to express their opinion. And I think, you know, we've got to be careful with that fine line as we talk about what we do to limit a person's ability to express themselves. But I think we also have to look out for the greater good and the safety of our communities. Covering your face for these events, clearly, as we have seen, is for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to remain anonymous and to be the ability to do whatever you want to do and to try to get away with it. I was having a conversation just prior to, as you all were on your voting, and that is, you know, if you think about it back to when you were a child and Halloween, masking up makes you anonymous. That's why children don't worry about throwing eggs at the neighbor's house, right, or throwing toilet paper in the neighbor's tree. It's because they're anonymous. And so masking up clearly causes problems. And I think, obviously, if there's something codification-wise that the Congress could do, I think that would be great. The other area would be, I know this is controversial, and I'll say it, but it's firearms. I think during these protests, the open carry of firearms is all it is adding gasoline to the fire. You're talking about emotional situations. People are emotional about their thoughts, and you're going to add in a firearm into that emotional powder keg. And so I think as you talk about how we regulate and how we assure people have their First Amendment right to express themselves, we need to look about how we can do that where they can do it safely with proper regulation.
Mr. Donovan, can I add something
Yes, certainly.
to that?
Please, sir.
You know, we put out a video after Charlottesville, made it available to police officers. We'll send out 50,000 free copies in January of it about mistakes that were made in Charlottesville. I think there were mistakes that were made. But as Chief Roush says, they had a tremendous handicap, and that was the Virginia open carry law that prohibited towns, counties, and cities from having anything that would be contrary to the open carry law. The University of Virginia could do it because it was an arm of the state, but the city of Charlottesville had its hands tied when people walked into that city with hate in their hearts and open guns. It's a real problem, and it's a problem in more than 30 states. I'd add, not to contradict anything that the Chief said, but the history of mask laws in our country is complicated. You know, there's this notion that I should perhaps be able to protest anonymously in order to protect myself from retaliation for expressing an unpopular view. I can't tell you I know what the state of the law is today, and it may vary in the circumstances, but it is not an uncomplicated point.
Thank you. Are there any other, Rabbi, the situations that were described earlier, the tragedies that we've experienced in our country, maybe the more recent ones? Do you see any other things, mistakes that may have happened, or if we had something in place, may have prevented some of the harm that was created?
Look, I think the key we heard from the first panel is intelligence, information, and access of that information to the people, especially to local hate crimes units. They have an incredible learning curve they have to master as they're thrown in from other arenas in order to be able to deal with the hate groups in their communities. So they could certainly use some more help. But I just wanted to actually say something positive, if I may, and that is that the concept of hate crime is always under assault. The concept is under assault, saying, well, if someone's raped, they're raped, and if they break a window, so you pay. But I think whether you're talking to African Americans or Jews or other minorities, when someone in your community is attacked, and it may only bring about the breaking of a $100 window, when that takes place during a Friday night service or in a church or in a school, an entire community is impacted. Hate crimes has not been universally embraced as a society idea or as a legal concept in other democracies, and is always being sniped at here in the States by a variety of individuals. So I think keeping focus on it, keeping the level playing field, so whether it's from the left or the right, you have to make sure it's not being used to bludgeon one political point or another. I think it's an extremely important and powerful tool that gives a sense of not so much redress, but when a community is hurting, they get the message that the rest of the community is generally with them, and that's part of an important healing process and one of the ways of keeping social peace.
You're right about the attitude towards hate crime. As I said, I was in office for 3 weeks when we indicted, a Caucasian man for viciously assaulting another Caucasian young man who happened to be in the company of a black woman. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman from New York. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. In following up on the discussion just a moment ago with respect to how weapons have complicated some of these situations, each of you did highlight in your testimony the threat of domestic extremists and terrorism. In recent domestic terrorist attacks, such as the incidents in Las Vegas, Orlando, and Sutherland Springs, firearms have been the weapon of choice. So what steps should Congress take to ensure that firearms don't end up in the hands of terrorists? Start with Mr. Cohen.
I'd defer to the Chief on this one if I could.
That's a great question. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that. I think that clearly, I think the challenge we have in background checks, as we have seen, the system is flawed at best, and so I think that's probably our first step is tightening up the background check process to assure that it is what it's supposed to be. When you can identify somebody that is a member of an organization, if you can identify that, that's another part of that challenge. That it's a difficult situation. I think we have to be careful. I know that there's some legislation moving now about reciprocity of moving guns across borders in terms of handgun reciprocity, handgun carry. That's a challenge. Not every state has the same level of restriction in terms of who can carry a firearm. And so that's concerning to those of us in law enforcement. And so I would tell you that I'm not the perfect expert on that, I don't think. I tell you it's a challenging topic, and I would tell you we've got to do better than what we're doing now.
I agree with you, and you're on the front lines, and I agree with your answers, and I appreciate your perspective and the job you're doing to try to keep us all safe. Let me turn to Mr. Cohen. In the recent election, Russia utilized social media to influence and interfere with our democratic process, demonstrating how a properly orchestrated online campaign can leverage a small investment into an outsized effect. How have we seen domestic terrorist groups utilize the same tools and methods to spread their message?
Look, all of these groups that we talk about are very, very active on social media because it's easy. Before Charlottesville, the message went out to white supremacists throughout the country to come and gather there. I think it was obvious prior to the event that there were going to be hundreds of white supremacists at that event. So, you know, as the rabbi said, you know, a local thing can quickly become national in scope or global in scope with the click of a button. I don't think there's any easy answer to deal with that.
Thank you.
Mr. Congressman, I'd like to just add to that. We've been talking to the companies about these issues for well over a decade. And let's be honest, the ads, the digital ads, basically an ATM machine, just the money making. And for when we brought the first case we brought to them was when a couple of ads for a Hezbollah-sponsored game that kids could get a hold of, I think showed up on a Washington Post just as a bot, you know, just showed up on various locations, undertakings from a known terrorist group. So the particular company in mind did figure out a way to remove it. I hate to keep coming back to it, but if we're talking about ads and the impact of ads, the bad players are looking at each other out there and saying, well, look, this looks like an easy mark. If we invest a certain amount of money, we're going to be able to get our message into the mainstream directly to the kind of audience we're looking for. And obviously, Hezbollah is not a state player, and you get Russia much more sophisticated with its own view. I think a great deal of this responsibility comes right back at the companies, and to a certain extent, it also comes right back to the consumer. I'll just give you one other example to think about, because these are not easy issues. One of the companies ran a short-term project in which they sent emails to teenagers saying that we have reason to believe you may be a target of online bullying. We hope if that's true, you're talking to an adult, you have a parent, whatever, but if you need help, email us and we'll send you a list of resources that you can turn to. Now, at first blush, that's a great idea, but you think about it, you ask yourself one question. How does this company know that this teenager has been bullied? And sort of like the unaddressed issue here is that these companies, not because they forced anyone, but because we gave the information voluntarily, know a lot more about predictive behavior than maybe some of our own federal agencies. They don't like to talk about it. It's not a big brother mentality. They're out to make money, but the potential is always there. And when you have a bad player like Russia understanding that potential and manipulating it, the next time it could be another victim. It may be from another state player or non-state player.
Yep, great insights. I appreciate you all for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. My time's expired, so I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman, Mr. Langevin. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rabbi Cooper, I'm going to speak on the connection between domestic extremism and international terrorism. specifically the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movements that attempt to shut down peaceful support of Israel are connected, my studies show, are connected with international terrorism movements. What connections have you seen, sir, can you refer to between BDS groups and a global terrorist and anti-Israel movement?
Well, you know, there's no question that since BDS movement, boycott and divestment, in its current form, back in the late 20th century, this kind of approach was used to great effect to pressure the apartheid regime in South Africa. And I happened to be present as a delegate in 2001, just before 9/11, at the UN conference against racism, where the mantle was transferred, not the halo, but the opposite. The new devil was the State of Israel. And that approach of demonizing democracy, our ally, has been part and parcel of anti-peace forces, of Hezbollah, of Hamas, of Iran, and others. And
so you do see that connection between domestic
the connection,
BDS movements and international terrorism.
Right. The connection may not always be operational, but these are not movements that came out of the, out of the thin air. I'll give one other example, if I may. There is a piece of potential legislation before the House right now called the Palestinian Children's Protection Act. And that basically, if it went into law, would say that the U.S. would reduce aid to Israel if it caused any violence to any Palestinian under the age of 18, even if they were involved in a terrorist act. Now, that did not come out of thin air either. There is now, you might say, in honor of Israel's upcoming 70th birthday or the 70th anniversary of Nakba, you have new themes that are being brought forward in the international community and right here in the halls of Congress. Again, they don't come from thin air. It's part of an overall global campaign to demonize the Jewish state. That is a part of the reality that we're struggling against, and our own State Department has recognized that some of these efforts do cross the line from legitimate criticism of a state or of a group of people into hate and anti-Semitism.
Thank you for your very thorough answer. In the interest of time, Mr. Cohen, I have further concerns, but the constraints of time will not allow me to address them. So I'm going to jump into money, sir. The Southern Poverty Law Centers the IRS recognizes SPLC as a nonprofit tax-exempt organization. Is that correct?
It is.
Since the SPLC is not subject to taxation, why would there be a need for the SPLC to have offshore accounts reported up to $69 million in areas like the Cayman Islands? As a tax-exempt nonprofit organization, the SPLC has no need for lawful tax avoidance. So what would be the legitimate reason that the SPLC would have millions and millions of dollars deposited in offshore accounts?
I appreciate the question. I think there's been some confusion in the press about this. It's common for nonprofit organizations, including universities, big foundations, to have money in offshore accounts. It avoids two things. First, it avoids a lot of certain kinds of filings, and it avoids unrelated business income tax. If I could finish very quickly.
I appreciate your answer. Will you state before this congressional committee definitively that all SPLC funds are received, held, and used for lawful purposes under U.S. law?
I will.
Thank you. Does the SPLC receive foreign money?
Not that I know of. We may have some donors in foreign countries. I'm sure we have some donors in England, for example, but we don't receive any money from governments,
Final question.
including the United States government.
Has the SPLC received money from any individual, entity, or organization that the State Department or Treasury Department has identified as connected to organized crime or terrorism?
Not that I know of course.
Not that you know of. Would you be prepared to present a full report regarding that?
No,
question to this committee?
I don't think we're going to present a listing of all of our donors to this committee or any
No,
other.
I'm specifically asking about donors that may have been identified by the United States government as terrorist organizations or international.
I'm not sure, Mr. Higgins, if you have some information that makes you think that, I'd be happy to check into it. But
That's what I'm asking, sir.
Well, if you have some information that tells you that that's a possibility, I'd want to look
Are
into
you
it because
suggesting
we would not want
I
to do
should
that.
provide your organization with your data on?
No, what I was suggesting was that if you think that we get money from criminal sources, I have no knowledge of that, and I would appreciate your letting me know who you think it is who's giving us money who we shouldn't.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'd like to submit in writing further questioning for the panel. I yield back.
Without objection, the Chair thanks the gentleman from Louisiana. The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First, allow me to introduce into the record a letter from 53 members of the Civil Rights Community Coalition of 53 Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Groups. I ask unanimous consent to submit the statement in the record. Oh, my God. Hello? Okay, I need to get extra time because
I'm sorry, without objection.
Okay, so I need some extra time on that. Thank you so very much. Let me also express my disappointment that the NAACP was not able to testify and that their invitation was issued less than 24 hours prior to the hearing, and the late notice has kept them from participating. I want to acknowledge the new president of the NAACP, who is a stellar leader on civil rights issues, Mr. Derek Johnson. His voice needs to be heard in this committee, and I certainly hope that we'll have the opportunity to hear from him as soon as possible. Let me go quickly to our very esteemed guests. Rabbi, first of all, allow me to acknowledge Simon Wiesenthal and this center, and to put on the record that he lost 89 members of his family. We have known of the center both in Texas but in the nation, and I cannot thank you for the nonviolent approach that you have taken and the peaceful approach you've taken, but the firm approach that you've taken against anti-Semitism, which certainly is both related and it's a deafening sound in this nation. So my question to you is basically in an area where I've worked, and that is the attack on religious institutions or religious affiliated community centers. We've had circumstances like that in Texas. And my question to you is, how can Congress be stronger on protecting those religious affiliated institutions who welcome all of us? There's not one of us that has not been in a synagogue and have been welcomed, and I might say, and you know, in a mosque and have been welcomed, because I know how your center works. How can we protect these facilities?
You know, I think we're at an interesting crossroad in America because you can also add churches.
Absolutely. I've worked on those issues.
Houses of worship are, in America, by definition, community centers. And that's one of the key points that bigots, racists, and anti-Semites and terrorists understand. That automatically puts them on the front line. I've read with great sympathy the church leaders who are trying to decide whether or not they have to put perimeter security in their houses of worship. For us, it hasn't been an option. I would imagine that for African Americans, because of the reality of racist hate crimes in this country, it's not really an option. At the end of the day, as we hear it now more as ISIS is being defeated on the battlefield, that the ultimate victory will only be when we defeat the ideas that fuel and feed the terrorists. The truth is that it's not so much on Congress, it's on Americans to try to come together and figure out ways how to drain the swamp of hatred, how to learn, to act together in concert, even though we may have different ways of praying or different political views.
Thank you.
That's not something you can legislate. That's on us.
I take you up on that, and that's certainly the reflection of the greatness of the center. Let me pose my two questions. I asked the chairman to indulge me for the time that I may have lost. So I'll pose the two questions first to the chief. Thank you so very much. Chief, you may have known that we were in judiciary with a reciprocal concealed weapons bill, and thank you to the major chiefs for their letter. So I think the way I will pose the question on the issue of guns is that the proliferation of such guns do make it a little more dangerous. And I take, for example, the individual that attacked the church in Charleston, South Carolina. That's the question I'm going to ask you. And I also made mention in judiciary of my concern for law enforcement officers. The question I have for Mr. Cohen, first of all, thank you for your work. You were trying to explain that Antifa, in your view, does not spew anti-anybody. They come dressed as they do, but they're dealing with the justice issues and trying to protect. So my question to you is, what tone is set when the leader of the free world offers or spews out words such as son of a bees, or uses a video of alt-right and neo-Nazi so much that the world condemns that utilization? What tone is set? How do we thwart that as people? Because I believe America is a great nation. Chief, would you comment on the question I asked you, and then if I can allow Mr. Cohen to answer his question. Thank you so very much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So in terms of guns, I think first and foremost, all law enforcement would tell you responsible gun ownership is what we expect.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, what we have seen in many communities throughout the country, and we've seen it in our state, and that is the relaxation of gun laws and allowing guns everywhere at any time. The Hiller decision by the Supreme Court said that there can be reasonable regulation.
Yeah.
And that's what we should have. We have seen an increase since the Castle Doctrine was moved from the home to the car in Tennessee. We've seen an increase in gun violence. We've seen more guns stolen out of vehicles. Because, again, responsible gun ownership also means keeping it safe from other people. And so we've seen an increase in guns being stolen. We've seen an increase in shootings in our community ever since that law was changed. And so I think we've got to be more methodical in how we regulate our firearms, and that is that's a challenge that I would put before you in Congress, and I thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Cohen.
Briefly, I would agree with Rabbi Cooper that it's the responsibility of each and every person in our country to drain the swamp of hate. But I would add that it would help a lot if the person who has the biggest bully pulpit in our country were to take the lead in consistently condemning hate rather than energizing it.
I join you in that, and I'd like to make a commitment that personally, and I know many of my colleagues will join you in standing up against hate. We thank you for the testimony, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for yielding to me. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to hit on a few things, and I hate to be constrained so by time, but each other member has as well. First, I would commend the Chief on his suggestion as it relates to criminal enhancements for certain things. I think we have a criminal justice situation in this country that begs reform. We're happy to be moving in a bipartisan manner toward that. We don't necessarily need new crimes. We need to enforce the ones that are on the books, but an enhancement makes real sense. It's not giving you that burden at trial. Secondly, the mask discussions, the guns discussions, et cetera. I am loath in this body to suggest a federal legislative answer to what should be doctrinally and federalism-wise a state level or local level problem. Now, I'm sympathetic to the arguments made by the folks on the panel that indeed localities and states should be empowered to make these decisions for themselves, but I would hate, and I can assure you I would not vote in favor of a federal mask law. It's draconian in its nature and perhaps in its application, and I don't even want to contemplate it. Having said that, I have no problem with the locality enforcing time, place, manner restrictions on otherwise protected rights. And tertiarily, Rabbi Cooper, I would correct you in respect where you say Hezbollah is not a state actor, but for the IRGC in Iran, there is no Hezbollah. Hezbollah came to be 3 years after the Iranian Revolution, and that while they are not a direct state actor,
they're an actor of a state.
Yes, sir. And again, that's with all due respect and no disrespect intended. To Mr. Cohen, You gave a number of the number of users on the website Stormfront, which is a Nazi affiliate, National Socialist affiliated website, prior to and after the Obama administration. Do you remember those numbers off the top of your head?
I do.
What were they?
In 2008, it was 140,000 registered users.
Yes, sir.
And today, over 330,000. That doesn't mean there are many millions of visitors.
I got
These
so
are people
little time.
registered.
I'm not trying to be rude, right? You got millions of visitors, but you've almost doubled your registration. We wouldn't prescribe that, though. That's not a result of the Obama administration.
Oh, no. As I said, it's
Right.
it's the continuing backlash to our country's changing demographics.
So, well, I think that's your opinion.
That's correct.
With due respect. And so, are you familiar what type of organization is the most prominent and preeminent numerically on your hate watch list of 900 and some odd groups?
I think it would probably be the Daily Stormer or the Nation of Islam.
No, I mean by number. How many?
That's what I was trying to answer.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead, real quick.
I was saying it was probably be the current count would probably be the Daily Stormer or the Nation of Islam.
So by definition, on your list, about 22% of the entire list are black separatist groups.
That's correct.
Right. And again, look, hate is hate is hate is hate is
I
hate.
agree.
When we moved to put in a law to make Barbara John's Day a holiday in Virginia, one of my colleagues said that's black history. I said, you can't have it. That's American history. We need to know that. And Simon Wiesenthal, I think, was wise in his words to suggest that for our benefit we should learn from the Jewish tragedy because the next victims very well may not be Jewish. And so that's the point that I make, that there's been an uptick. In fact, in 2000, the number of black separatist groups was about 1/12 of your list. Is that about right?
I don't remember the ratio.
Well, off your website, it would indicate that 48 out of 610 extremist groups listed by Hate Watch in 2000 were black separatists, and now it's about almost 200 out of about 900.
Right, and we report those numbers.
And again,
of
this
course.
isn't President Obama's fault.
Well, I mean,
It's not, is it? I mean, I don't think it is.
I wasn't claiming it was fault. I was trying to explain.
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting is that there's no doubt, right, that there are real, live, living, breathing Nazis. And tragically, we saw them in my congressional district. But to ascribe the presence of despicable, reprehensible individuals who can't grasp the basic concept of Dr. King's premise that we should judge individuals based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin, but to say, well, this is because of the rhetoric of one individual, I think oversimplifies the problem, correct?
Well, I'm not sure I'm not sure I was guilty of what you're suggesting.
I'm not suggesting you were. If someone were to say that the prevalence of these groups is because the rhetoric of one individual, that would be oversimplifying the problem, would it not?
Depending on the individual, I think it depends.
So here's my concern, because what your organization has done and done well is attack evil in the form of things like the Klan. However, would you be shocked if I told you that from the public records, as it relates to the leadership of your organization, the political giving is almost exclusively and to the tune of almost 100% in one direction? Would that surprise you?
I don't think it's accurate.
If I were to tell you that it were, would that surprise you?
It would. We have many Republican donors of...
No, sir. I'm talking about the gifts from the people in your organization to political causes.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I'm sure that's right.
Okay.
And there are not that many people in Southern Poverty Law Center who make political contributions.
But some do, and
sure.
It wouldn't surprise you to learn that they were almost exclusively in one direction.
It would not.
Okay. And you've worked with other groups, for example, Media Matters, the Center for New Community, and Rethink Media to come up with lists, correct?
We have.
Okay. Would it surprise you if I were to tell you that based on public records, the political giving of the leadership of those organizations was also almost exclusively in one direction?
No, it would not.
Okay. And would you contest the assertion, and I would categorize National Socialism...
You haven't given up your days as a trial lawyer, have you, Mr. Garrett? Go ahead.
But again, it's an interesting paradigm I find myself in because I respect what you do.
Thank you.
I'm concerned with how you're doing it. And here's where I'm going with this. I think it's a fair historical fact to say that the deadliest collective force in human history, probably just after National Socialism, would be communism, which inarguably is a dogma of the left. I am not ascribing values to anyone. I am suggesting, however, that it troubles those to see an entity that has essentially been de facto made responsible for determining what is and isn't hate, that skews almost exclusively, as do their collaborators, in a particular direction. And so I guess I admonish you to listen to folks like Mr. Perry, who says, I don't even remember the name of the organization, are you familiar with them, and become familiar with them. Now,
I'm not sure who you're talking about, Mr. Perry. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Congressman.
It's okay. So let me finish, because I've
Please.
just kind of poked at you, but it's not with
Just
malice.
a little bit.
But it's not with malice. You deserve credit at SPLC for being the first group to point out, for example, that Jason Kessler, who was the organizer of the Unite the Right rally, with which I would take exception to the name because, again, I'm an individualist in the Randian sense. I think the individual is the ultimate minority and everyone has a right to be left alone so long as they're not hurting someone else. But you were the first people to point out that his previous affiliations had been with the Occupy movement. And you deserve credit for that, right? And so I hope and ask that you recognize that hatred in any form is hatred, that violence in any form is violence, and that victims in any form are victims.
And we always have.
And I encourage you to continue to, but the perception by outside individuals, and I think based on life experience, is that if all the leadership of an organization skews in a particular political direction, there might be a bias, which then gives rise to a lack of credibility for what you do that should be important work. Do you understand why that might be a concern of people?
I understand why it's a concern to you.
Yeah, well, do you understand why that might be a concern of people?
Look, the liberal tradition is an inclusive one. Hate is the opposite of that liberal tradition of inclusivity. So it's not surprising to me that people at the Southern Poverty Law Center, people at other inclusive organizations tend to give money to liberal organizations. It seems obvious to me.
Well, again, we could sit and discuss the origins of classical liberalism versus modern liberalism all day long, but my life philosophy is treat everyone as you'd want to be treated.
Of course.
And do no harm.
Absolutely.
And that the Jeffersonian construct of liberty should be adhered to, which is so long as you're not hurting someone else, who cares who you sleep with? Who cares how you worship? Et cetera, et cetera. But it strikes me as I look at the groups that are chosen, Liberty Council,
Yes.
Family Research Council,
Yes.
when Flanagan walks in with Chick-fil-A sandwiches to rub in the faces of his victims,
It's called
and it's not your fault.
That's
I'm not saying
absolutely
it is.
true.
But I mean, I would hope that the important work you do not be co-opted by any ideological drive that causes you to miss other threats.
Well, I appreciate your concern about our work, and I am sure that if you knew as much as we did about the Family Research Council, you too would keep them at arm's length.
Well, I'm way over time. I would love to have the opportunity to sit and talk more. I thank all three of the
I
panelists.
look forward to seeing you in Charlottesville.
Yeah, and invite you guys to come by the office anytime. Give me a little bit of advance notice so I can make sure I can be there. But thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Chair thanks the gentleman. I thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these or those questions in writing. The chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I'd like to include in the record, and ask unanimous consent to do so, a statement from the Council on American Islamic Relations.
Without objection. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7 Delta, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Tonight, Texas